the wedding, my new husband slapped my daughter and said, "You are such a failure." The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the manicured gardens where my wedding was being held. It was a dream setting. White roses adorned the arches, champagne glasses sparkled under fairy lights, and soft music floated in the air. I should have been ecstatic, standing there in my ivory gown beside my new husband, David. But a heavy knot of tension had been sitting in my chest all day. From the moment we announced our engagement, my daughter, Mia, had been distant. At 16, she was fiercely independent and deeply protective of me. She had never hidden her distrust of David, but I had brushed it off as teenage stubbornness. She'll come around, I told myself. She just needs time. But as the reception began, it was clear Mia had no interest in pretending for the sake of appearances. She sat at the corner table with her phone in hand, earbuds firmly in place, avoiding eye contact with everyone. "Shouldn't your daughter be a bit more involved?" David whispered as we mingled with guests. His smile was polished, his words wrapped in that practiced charm that had won me over so easily. "She's still adjusting," I said, brushing it off. "It's been a lot for her." David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to our guests with another one of his signature jokes, and the laughter rippled across the garden. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe everything would be fine. The evening progressed, and the first dance was magical. I spun in David's arms, his grin infectious as the guests cheered us on. But my gaze kept drifting to Mia, who hadn't moved from her corner. Claire, my best friend, approached her with a plate of food, trying to coax her into joining the festivities. Mia shook her head, her face set in that stubborn way I knew too well. David noticed. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "She's embarrassing you." "She's just being a teenager," I replied, though his words stung. David sighed, setting down his champagne glass. "I'll handle it." Alarm bells rang in my head as he crossed the lawn toward Mia's table. I followed, weaving through the crowd as quickly as I could without causing a scene. By the time I reached them, David was standing over Mia, his voice low and sharp. "Mia," he said, his tone laced with frustration, "put the phone down. You're being rude." Mia looked up at him, unbothered. "I didn't ask to be here." David's jaw clenched. "Your mother's worked hard for this day. The least you can do is show some respect. She worked hard to marry a guy I don't even like." Mia shot back, her voice dripping with defiance. The guests nearby began to glance over, sensing the tension. I stepped forward, ready to defuse the situation. But before I could say a word, David's voice rose. "You're such a failure," he snapped, the words slicing through the air like a whip. And then it happened. His hand came down, a sharp crack echoing as it struck her cheek. Time seemed to freeze. Mia's hand flew to her face, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. The murmur of the crowd fell silent, the music cutting off mid-note. Every pair of eyes turned toward us. "David!" I screamed, stepping between him and Mia. "She's been disrespectful all day," he said coldly, as though his actions were justified. "Someone had to put her in her place." Tears welled up in Mia's eyes, but she didn't cry. Instead, she glared at him with a fury I'd never seen before. Without another word, she turned and ran across the garden, disappearing into the shadows. I turned to David, my heart pounding. "How could you do that?" "She deserved it," he said, his voice calm and unrepentant. "You've let her walk all over you for years. Someone had to teach her a lesson." My hands trembled as I stared at the man I had just promised to spend my life with. I had seen flashes of his temper before, but never anything like this. Never directed at my daughter. "This isn't over," I whispered, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. The guests began to disperse, the celebratory mood thoroughly destroyed. Claire found me in the chaos, her face pale. "Where's Mia?" she asked. "I don't know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I need to find her." Claire nodded. "I'll handle things here. Go." I found Mia sitting by the fountain at the far end of the garden, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her makeup was smudged, and the red mark on her cheek stood out starkly against her pale skin. "Mia," I said softly, sitting beside her. She didn't look at me. "You married him." "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I didn't know he was capable of this." She turned to me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. "You should have listened to me. I told you he wasn't a good guy." "I know," I said, reaching for her hand. "I made a mistake. But I promise you, I'll fix this." Mia pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "You can't fix people like him, Mom. You should have chosen me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She stood and walked back toward the house, leaving me alone by the fountain. As I sat there, the weight of my decisions crashed down on me. This day, which was supposed to mark the start of a new chapter, had instead exposed the cracks in everything I thought I knew. David's true nature, Mia's pain, my own blindness. It was all laid bare. But I couldn't let this be the end. I had to protect my daughter, even if it meant unraveling the life I had just vowed to build. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The day after the wedding was a storm of chaos and tension. The once perfect garden, littered with forgotten champagne glasses and trampled flower petals, felt like a mockery of the fairy tale I'd tried to build. Inside the house, the silence was suffocating. Mia locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to anyone. I knocked softly on her door, my heart aching. "Mia, please let me in. I just want to talk." Her voice was muffled, but the anger was clear. "I have nothing to say to you." I rested my forehead against the door, tears threatening to spill again. "I'm so sorry, Mia. I'll make this right." Silence. Then, finally, "You can't." David, on the other hand, was unbothered. He sat in the living room, scrolling through his phone as if nothing had happened. The calmness in his demeanor made my skin crawl. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "About what you did to Mia," I snapped. "You slapped her, David. At our wedding. In front of everyone." David set his phone down, leaning back in his chair. "She was disrespectful, Sarah. She humiliated you. She humiliated us. That doesn't justify what you did," I shouted. "You had no right to lay a hand on her." David's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to an unsettling calm. "I did what you were too afraid to do. She's been acting like a spoiled brat for months. Someone needed to set boundaries." "She's my daughter," I said, my voice breaking. "Not yours. And if you ever touch her again, I swear." David stood abruptly, towering over me. "Or what, Sarah? What are you going to do?" My breath caught in my throat. The man I had thought I loved was a stranger now, his charm stripped away to reveal something darker, colder. I retreated to my room, closing the door behind me and sinking onto the bed. My mind raced, replaying the events of the previous night over and over. How had I missed this side of him? How had I let myself believe he was the perfect man? The answer was painfully clear. I had been so desperate for love, for stability, that I had ignored every red flag. And now Mia was paying the price for my mistakes. That evening, Claire called. She had stayed behind after the wedding to smooth things over with the guests and deal with the fallout. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "No," I admitted. "I don't know what to do, Claire. He's not who I thought he was." Claire didn't hesitate. "Leave him." "I can't just leave," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is," she argued. "He hit Mia, Sarah. That's all the reason you need." I wanted to believe her, but the thought of tearing apart my new life felt overwhelming. "I need time to figure this out." "You don't have time," Claire said. "He's dangerous, Sarah. You need to protect Mia." Her words sent a chill through me. I had spent so long trying to convince myself that David was the answer to our problems, but now I realized he might be the biggest threat of all. The next morning, David tried to act as if everything was normal. He made coffee, read the newspaper, and even offered to make breakfast. His attempts at normalcy felt like a manipulation, a way to erase the previous night. When Mia finally emerged from her room, she avoided him completely, brushing past him without a word. He watched her go, his jaw tightening, but said nothing. As soon as she was out of earshot, he turned to me. "You need to get her under control." My stomach churned. "What does that mean?" "She's out of line," he said, his voice low. "You let her get away with too much." "She's my daughter," I said firmly. "And she's not the problem here, you are." David's eyes narrowed. "Be careful, Sarah. You don't want to push me." That afternoon, I decided I needed to get away. I told David I was taking Mia to the park to clear our heads. But in reality, I just wanted to put distance between us and him. Mia was reluctant to come at first, but she finally agreed after I promised we'd stop for ice cream. As we sat on a bench near the pond, Mia stared at the water, her expression unreadable. "Why did you marry him?" The question caught me off guard. "I thought he was a good man," I said honestly. "I thought he'd make our lives better." Mia turned to me, her eyes filled with hurt. "You didn't think about me at all." Her words cut deeper than any slap ever could. She was right. I had been so focused on my own happiness that I hadn't considered how it would affect her. And now I was watching the fallout of my choices play out in real time. When we returned home, the house felt colder somehow. David was in his office, the door closed. I tried to convince myself that we could get through this, that we could fix what had been broken. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. Not for Mia's sake and not for mine. Something had to change. The tension in the house was unbearable. David's presence loomed like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Mia avoided him entirely, retreating to her room or slipping out to meet her friends after school. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the rift between us was growing deeper by the day. David, on the other hand, acted as though nothing had happened. He went about his routine, reading the paper, taking calls for work, and even making small talk during dinner. His charm, once disarming, now felt like a weapon he wielded to maintain control. One evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, David appeared in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. I put the dish towel down, bracing myself. "About what?" "About Mia," he said. "This attitude of hers needs to stop." "She's a teenager," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "She's upset. Can you blame her after what you did?" David's jaw tightened. "I've told you before. She needs discipline. You've let her walk all over you for years, and now she thinks she can do the same to me. She doesn't need discipline, David. She needs respect," I said firmly. "And she's not going to get that from someone who hits her." His eyes darkened, and he took a step closer. "Be very careful, Sarah. You don't want to turn this into something it doesn't need to be." My heart raced, but I refused to back down. "You're right. It doesn't need to be anything, because this ends now." "What does that mean?" he demanded. "It means I'm done," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not going to let you hurt her, or me, ever again." The next morning, I began making plans. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, not with Mia's safety at stake. I reached out to Claire, who immediately offered her spare room. "Just say the word, and I'll come help you pack," she said. "I'll let you know," I replied, glancing over my shoulder to make sure David wasn't listening. "I just need to figure out the right time." But as the day wore on, I realized there would never be a perfect time. Every moment in that house felt like a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. That evening, as I sat in the living room, Mia came downstairs and perched on the edge of the couch. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Mom, are we leaving?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask?" "Because you're acting weird," she said. "And because I heard you on the phone with Aunt Claire." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Yes, we're leaving. But we need to be careful." Mia nodded, her expression serious. "I'll help." Her maturity in that moment was both heartbreaking and inspiring. I had underestimated her strength, and now, more than ever, I was determined to do whatever it took to protect her. The plan was simple. Pack our essentials and leave the house while David was at work. I'd already secured a storage unit for our belongings and arranged for Claire to pick us up. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best I could do on short notice. The morning of our escape, I woke up early and started packing. Mia moved quickly and quietly, stuffing her clothes and books into a suitcase. We worked in silence, the weight of what we were about to do hanging heavy in the air. At 9 a.m., David left for work without suspicion. As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I called Claire. "We're ready," I said. "On my way," she replied. As we loaded our bags into Claire's car, a sense of relief began to wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But that relief was short-lived. Just as we were about to pull out of the driveway, David's car appeared at the end of the street. My heart stopped. "Go," I whispered urgently to Claire. She didn't need to be told twice. The tires screeched as she backed out of the driveway and sped down the street. I turned to look out the rear window and saw David's car stop abruptly. He must have seen us because seconds later he was following. "He's coming," I said, my voice shaking. "Hold on," Claire said, gripping the wheel tightly. The chase was harrowing. Claire weaved through traffic, taking sharp turns to lose him, but David stayed close. Mia clutched my arm, her face pale with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We keep going," I said, though I wasn't sure where. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Claire pulled into the parking lot of a police station. She parked near the entrance, and we scrambled out of the car. David's car pulled up moments later, but when he saw where we were, he hesitated. His fury was evident even from a distance, but he didn't get out. Instead, he slammed his hands against the steering wheel and sped away. Inside the station, I explained everything to the officers on duty. They listened intently, taking notes as I recounted the events of the past few weeks. When I mentioned the slap at the wedding, one of the officers shook his head in disgust. "You did the right thing coming here," he said. "We'll make sure he doesn't bother you again." As I sat in the station with Mia and Claire, a sense of exhaustion settled over me. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time I felt like we had a chance. I had made mistakes, big ones, but I was finally taking the steps to make things right. The fluorescent lights of the police station felt harsh, amplifying my exhaustion. Mia sat beside me, silent but visibly tense, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Claire paced near the vending machine, her phone glued to her ear as she updated her husband on the situation. The officer, a calm but serious man named Detective Harris, returned with a cup of water for me. "We've entered a report into the system, Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone reassuring. "We'll start a restraining order process against your husband. But I need to ask, do you feel safe returning home?" I shook my head. "No, I don't think we'll ever feel safe there again." Detective Harris leaned forward, his expression grim. "Given what you've told us about your husband's behavior, his temper, his need for control, I'd advise you to stay somewhere secure for the time being. A friend's place, a shelter, even a hotel. Just make sure he doesn't know where you are." Claire chimed in, finally hanging up her call. "They're staying with me. He won't come near them while I'm around." Harris nodded. "Good. We'll send patrols near your house and your sister's. But keep your phone on you at all times. And if you see him or feel threatened, call 911 immediately." As we left the station, the weight of everything settled heavily on my shoulders. The adrenaline of the chase had faded, leaving me feeling raw and vulnerable. Mia walked beside me, her face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry, Mia," I said softly as we got into Claire's car. "I should have listened to you from the start." She didn't say anything for a moment, just stared out the window. Then, finally, she whispered, "Just don't go back to him, Mom. Promise me." "I promise," I said, my voice firm. "We're done with him." The next few days at Claire's house were a blur of tension and uncertainty. I spent hours on the phone with lawyers and social workers, trying to navigate the legal steps needed to protect myself and Mia. Every time the phone rang or a car drove by, my heart would race, fear gripping me. Mia seemed quieter than usual, but her presence kept me grounded. One night, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, she leaned against me and said, "I'm glad we left." Her words gave me a flicker of hope. Maybe we were finally moving in the right direction. But David wasn't done with us. On the third night at Claire's, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You think you can run from me? You're making a mistake, Sarah." My blood ran cold. I showed the message to Claire, who immediately called Detective Harris. "He's harassing her," she said into the phone, her voice tight with anger. "What are you going to do about it?" The next morning, Harris called to inform me that David had been served with a restraining order. "He's officially barred from contacting you or coming within 500 feet of you and your daughter," he said. "If he violates the order, we'll arrest him." It was a relief, but a fragile one. Restraining orders were just pieces of paper, and I knew David's temper too well to believe he'd let it stop him. Later that day, Claire and I drove to the house to gather the rest of our belongings. Mia stayed behind with Claire's husband, too shaken to return to the place she now considered a prison. Walking into the house felt surreal. The walls, the furniture, the photos. It all felt tainted, as though David's presence had seeped into every corner. I moved quickly, packing essentials while Claire kept watch near the door. As I sorted through papers in the office, I found something that made my stomach drop. A small black notebook shoved into the back of a drawer. Inside were pages of notes, appointments, reminders, and names I didn't recognize. One name, however, stood out: Mia Harper. Next to it, he had written a single word: leverage. I stared at the notebook, my hands trembling. What was David planning? Was he trying to use Mia against me? I took photos of the pages with my phone and stuffed the notebook into my bag. Whatever this was, it was proof that David's obsession wasn't just about me, it was about control. As we left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The street was quiet, but every shadow felt like a threat. Claire noticed my unease and rested a hand on my shoulder. "We've got this," she said. "He's not going to win." That evening, I showed the photos of the notebook to Detective Harris. His expression darkened as he scrolled through them. "This is troubling," he admitted. "It suggests he's not just angry. He's planning something. What can we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We're adding this to the case," Harris said. "It strengthens the restraining order and gives us more leverage to act if he tries anything." I nodded, though the fear still lingered. David was slipping further into obsession, and I wasn't sure how far he was willing to go. As the days passed, I tried to create a sense of normalcy for Mia. We stayed at Claire's, safe and surrounded by people who cared about us. But the anxiety never fully lifted. Every time the phone rang, every time a car slowed near the house, my heart would leap into my throat. Then one night it happened. Around midnight, Claire shook me awake. "There's someone outside," she whispered. I bolted upright, my adrenaline spiking. "Did you call the police?" She nodded. "They're on their way." Peering out the window, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the driveway. The faint glow of the street lamp illuminated his face. It was David. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the house. Within minutes, the police arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness. David didn't resist as they approached him, but his eyes never left mine as they placed him in handcuffs. As they led him away, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. This was the man I had once loved, the man I thought would be my partner. But now he was a stranger, consumed by his need for power and control. Back inside, Mia hugged me tightly. "Is it over?" she asked. I kissed the top of her head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're going to be okay." David's arrest brought temporary relief, but the unease didn't disappear. Detective Harris called the next morning to inform me that David had been released on bail. "It's standard procedure," he explained, his tone apologetic. "But with the restraining order in place and his recent behavior documented, we'll keep a close eye on him." His words didn't reassure me. If David was bold enough to show up at Claire's house once, there was no guarantee he wouldn't do it again. I tried to focus on rebuilding a sense of normalcy for Mia. We extended our stay at Claire's, and I enrolled Mia in counseling to help her process everything she'd been through. She was reluctant at first, but after a few sessions, I noticed small changes. A lighter tone in her voice, fewer nights spent locked in her room. "Do you feel better?" I asked one evening as we sat on the porch watching the sun set. "A little," she admitted. "But I don't think I'll ever stop being angry at him." "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to forgive him. You just have to heal." One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. She had been working with me to finalize my divorce from David, but now her voice carried a note of urgency. "Sarah, we've hit a complication," she said. "What kind of complication?" "David's filed a motion for custody." The words felt like a punch to the gut. "What?" I stammered. "Why would he do that?" "I suspect it's a power play," she replied. "His chances of winning are slim, given the restraining order and his recent arrest. But he might be trying to scare you, or keep you tied to him." I felt a wave of nausea. "What do I do?" "We'll fight it," she said firmly. "But you need to be prepared. He'll likely try to discredit you, claim you're unfit or unstable." The thought of David trying to take Mia from me was unbearable. "He'll never win," I said, more to myself than to her. In the following days, I threw myself into preparing for the custody hearing. I gathered documents, character references, and photos that painted a clear picture of David's behavior. Claire and several other friends offered to testify on my behalf, and even Detective Harris agreed to provide a statement about David's threats and the incident at Claire's house. Mia, however, was growing more withdrawn. "Do I have to see him?" she asked one night, her voice small. "Not if you don't want to," I assured her. "You can tell the judge how you feel." "What if they don't believe me?" she whispered. "They will," I said, squeezing her hand. "You're brave, Mia. Braver than you know." The custody hearing was tense. David sat across the courtroom, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the man who had shattered our lives. His lawyer painted him as a loving stepfather concerned for Mia's well-being, while casting me as overly emotional and impulsive. I wanted to scream, to stand up and tell everyone the truth, but I forced myself to stay calm. My lawyer methodically dismantled their arguments, presenting evidence of David's violence and manipulation. When it was Mia's turn to speak, my heart ached for her. She sat stiffly in the witness chair, her voice quiet but steady as she described what David had done. "I don't feel safe with him," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I don't ever want to see him again." After what felt like an eternity, the judge ruled in our favor. David's motion for custody was denied, and the restraining order was extended. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't the end. That night, as we celebrated quietly at Claire's, Mia asked, "Do you think he'll stop now?" "I hope so," I said, though I wasn't convinced. David wasn't the type to give up easily, and his need for control made him unpredictable. 2 days later, Detective Harris called with an update that sent chills down my spine. "We've been monitoring David, and it seems he's been trying to hire someone to follow you," he said. "What?" I gasped. "Why?" "We don't know yet, but we intercepted communication suggesting he's planning something. We're keeping him under surveillance, but you need to be extra cautious." The revelation shook me to my core. It wasn't enough for David to lose. He needed to maintain power, even if it meant going to extreme lengths. I began to take extra precautions, avoiding public places and staying in constant contact with Harris and Claire. Mia sensed my fear and grew quieter, retreating into herself again. One night, as I tucked her into bed, she asked, "Will we ever feel normal again?" Tears welled in my eyes, but I forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. It'll take time, but we'll get there." The next morning, as I stepped outside to grab the mail, I noticed something unusual. A black car idling at the end of the street. My heart raced as I quickly ducked back inside, locking the door behind me. I called Harris immediately. "There's someone watching the house," I said, my voice trembling. "We'll send someone over," he assured me. Minutes later, the car sped off, but the damage was done. The message was clear. David wasn't finished. That night, as I sat with Claire and Mia, I made a decision. "We need to disappear," I said. Claire looked at me, startled. "Disappear? Where?" "Anywhere," I said. "As long as it's far away from here." Harris supported the plan, connecting me with a relocation specialist who could help us start fresh. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to ensure our safety. As I packed our things, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. This wasn't just about running, it was about reclaiming our lives. Packing up our lives was surreal. The weight of everything we were leaving behind. Friends, familiar places, memories was heavy, but the prospect of safety made it bearable. Claire helped us prepare, her steady presence a lifeline in the chaos. Detective Harris had arranged for us to move under a relocation program. It wasn't as formal as witness protection, but it offered anonymity and resources to help us start over. New documents, new identities, and a fresh start far from David's reach. On the morning of our departure, Mia stood in her room, staring at the few boxes we'd packed. Her favorite books and a worn photo album were tucked into her backpack, the rest left behind. "Are you ready?" I asked gently. She turned to me, her expression a mix of sadness and determination. "I just want to feel safe." I nodded, my throat tight. "We will. Promise." The drive to our new home was quiet. The relocation specialist had chosen a small town several states away, tucked into the hills with a population barely big enough to fill a high school gym. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions, and strangers were simply visitors passing through. As we pulled into the driveway of the modest house waiting for us, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a small garden, and a porch that overlooked the woods, but it was ours, a chance to rebuild. The first few weeks were an adjustment. Mia started at a new school, blending in as best she could while keeping her guard up. I found a part-time job at a local diner, grateful for the normalcy it brought. Life was quiet, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. But David still haunted my thoughts. Every unknown car, every shadowed figure on the street, sent my heart racing. Harris kept in touch, updating me on the investigation. "We're monitoring him closely," he assured me during one call. "He hasn't made any moves recently, but we're not letting our guard down." One afternoon, as I sat on the porch grading Mia's homework, something I'd promised to help her catch up on, she joined me with 2 mugs of tea. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "do you think he'll ever stop?" I looked at her, taking in the strength she'd grown into over the past weeks. "I don't know," I admitted, "but even if he doesn't, he won't find us. And if he tries, we'll be ready." She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I believe you." The turning point came unexpectedly. One evening, Harris called with an update that sent a wave of relief through me. "David's been arrested," he said. "We caught him trying to hire someone to track you down. The charges are serious enough to put him away for a long time." I clutched the phone tightly, tears streaming down my face. "Are you sure? He can't get out this time." "I'm sure," Harris said. "You and Mia can finally breathe easy." For the first time in months, I felt the tension in my chest ease. I called Claire to share the news, her cheer lifting my spirits even more. "That man won't ever hurt you again," she said firmly. "You did it, Sarah. You got her out. You got yourself out." In the weeks that followed, life began to take shape in a way that felt normal. Mia joined a local art club, her creativity flourishing in a way I hadn't seen since before David entered our lives. I started volunteering at her school, reconnecting with parts of myself I had forgotten. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the hills, Mia turned to me and smiled. "This feels like home," she said softly. I reached for her hand, my heart swelling with gratitude. "It is." I knew the scars of our past wouldn't fade overnight. There were still moments when a loud noise or an unexpected phone call made me jump. But each day brought a little more peace, a little more healing. David had tried to control us, to break us, but we had survived. More than that, we had escaped. And now we were free to build a future on our terms. Months turned into a year, and the fear that had once dominated our lives began to feel like a distant memory. On the anniversary of our move, Mia and I planted a tree in the backyard, a symbol of growth, resilience, and new beginnings. As we stood together, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves, I realized something. We weren't just survivors. We were stronger, braver, and more united than ever before.